So at this point, I would maybe give the word to Max, and maybe because he's of a younger generation than I am, and he was not part of Šum then, but that is also maybe a moment where our paths somehow crossed, and then he became a member of our team. How he experienced this shift and how he what was the situation in theory and in general cultural discourse then, and why maybe these ideas were important to bring forth and then continue to develop with his own editorial work as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's very hard to kind of give you a concise story or a proper explanation of why this text was important for the Ljubljana local scene, but nevertheless I can say that until that time, 2016, the climate in Ljubljana or this kind of intellectual production was quite different than it is now. And if I could point out two main factors, the first one would be that the theoretical production was firmly based within this philosophical tradition within the Faculty of Arts, and most notably connected to the Ljubljana Lacanian School by now famous philosophers like Žižek, Dolar, Alenka Supančič and others. So if we take a step back and think about this milieu that started in the 80s and where it emerged, of course it emerged in Yugoslavia, and then the conflict or the societal antagonisms were of a different nature. And for example, if you take a historical look how Lacanian School emerged in Ljubljana, it was as a kind of reaction against, on the one hand, Heideggerianism, that basically jump-started Slovenian philosophy, and the Frankfurt School. So in the 80s, Ljubljana Lacanian School was a very novel theoretical endeavor, of course connected to the fact that Žižek and others did their PhD in Paris and then met these famous psychoanalytic practitioners and theoreticians Lacan was a father-in-law with Jacques Miller, who was a mentor of Žižek. But nonetheless, the important point is that not only was this a novel theoretical conjecture, but also it was still firmly embedded within the Yugoslavian historical trajectory, which was, of course, socialist and therefore anti-capitalist. And as we all know, the novelty of Slovenian Lacanian School was that they were successful in revitalizing Hegel, who is of course the most important philosophical influence in Ljubljana, of course as the biggest influence on Marx, who is of course the most important figure of socialist or communist, and they connected it with the reading of Lacan, who was who kind of revitalized Hegelian scholarship, and through it a more radical societal critique was possible. And at that time, in 1980s, the first book by Žižek in English, Sublime Object of Ideology, is published, and then basically this kind of Slovenian philosophical milieu became known in the international space as well. But this became then our horizon. This was kind of the epitome of doing philosophy in Ljubljana, and because of its success and influence, new generations kind of were prepared to walk that path and kind of became Lacanian scholars themselves. And of course it had many good outputs, and it was definitely connected also to, I don't know, Metelkova squats and things like that, but not to get, of course, it was highly relevant, but at one point when, let's say in 2010s, it kind of started to lose traction, or at least the antagonisms that these theories were tackling weren't exactly representative of the situations of a younger generation, and this was becoming apparent everywhere, like in the classroom, how professors were responding at our questions regarding technology, technological innovation, social change. All of it was still illustrated within these binary oppositions, or with this kind of resignatory attitude that this kind of anti-capitalist demeanor made possible. And also, at that time, I started working on this oldest alternative European radio that is in Ljubljana, called Radio Student, and all of these binary were seen in place there as well. Like, there was still this kind of very strict distinction between alternative and mainstream culture. So you weren't even allowed to, I don't know, play a song by Solange, Beyonce's sister, because it was deemed like this is a product of a capitalist culture and this is not who we are. This is like kind of it was branded within this trajectory. And even like the project by Žižek and others, I'm definitely not criticizing them, but just kind of putting into perspective, was again focused on the ideological critique, and it was again about about the search or the possibility to construct a theoretical and practical position that wouldn't be recuperated by the mechanisms of capitalism. As you all know, different critiques by avant-gardes and other approaches were quickly instrumentalized, like situationism and then avant-garde cinema by Netflix. So we all know the difficulty, but this was this was their project, and maybe the most clear example of that is this repeated quote by Žižek and Jameson, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So for them, the goal was to imagine what would post-capitalist society be, or how can we reach it, or how can we even start doing it, because capitalism is such a totalizing societal project. But for us, maybe younger generation, more like educated on the internet and things like that, this kind of attitude wasn't necessarily that representative, and the question of technological change were more important. And by doing that, a different kind of theoretical perspective or position was really fruitful, not only because it wasn't taken for 40 years in the Ljubljana intellectual space, but also because it could put a different perspective and produce a kind of surplus, a better understanding of what our situation is and what exactly are what exactly is pulling our strings, or what are the agencies in play. And for example, the novelty by Primož Krašovec, this essay Alien Capital, was exactly that. Constructing a theory of capitalism through Marxism, just without the social critique that is inherently embedded in the Marxist project. So you have all of these building blocks in place, just without class struggle or this kind of important momentums within his work. So Primož Krašovec, of course, we know that within capitalism, within Marxism, Marx is from the start anti-moralizing and doesn't have any pretensions of, I don't know, subjective will, and he's like a social constructivist, so we live in a capitalist system, we shouldn't put blame on capitalists, but the system in place. So all of these fundamentals are already in play, but the novelty by Alien Capital was that if we kind of try to affirm these forces or processes that are taking place, potentially we can kind of see that we are a part of a different trajectory or that our problems are a part of a different structure that has been under-theorized because of our initial bias. Also, our understanding of capitalism was also placed at the beginning. This means in the time of Marx, again, 19th century London. So this was kind of like the momentum and the historical conjecture within German idealism and stuff like that. But again, alien capital, the idea was radically inverse. Like, we shouldn't try to understand capitalism from the beginning, but from the end. So we should kind of reverse our like time loop and start to think about which kind of identity or construction is capitalism approaching through its internal dynamics. We all know that capitalism goes through these processes, it changes technologically, socially, so it's radically transforming society. But rather than kind of try to contain this transformation, we should rather think about what will this transformation look like, I don't know, 50 years in the future, especially now when we have like things like artificial intelligence, or even like if we are more specific, like real breakthroughs within deep learning and things like that. So this was like kind of the framework or kind of the approach that was fruitful at that time and novel, I think.
But I mentioned these questions of theory fiction now and the future, and maybe Max again can here say something about how these two are related and why these fictional approaches then suddenly became important for Schum. And we also somehow renamed the journal from being a journal for contemporary art and theory to journal for contemporary art and theory fiction. And theory fiction has a certain history in cybernetic cultural research done in UK in the 90s, but also in science fiction and literature that deals with ideas of technology, but maybe was through the history of literature not recognized as the art form, but seemed important then somehow also for us.
Thank you. Again, theory fiction is a very unstable concept, so at this point it probably means different things in different contexts, and I believe that people like in different fields like use it in different ways, which is totally fine. But maybe like one liner of what theory fiction is basically fictions that are making themselves real, or that are becoming real. And as Tjaša was kind of suggesting, this is of course connected to cybernetics and this kind of ability of a system to kind of like produce to act in a way that is self-ampliative and that is immanently embedded within this process of reality testing, or basically like within the cybernetics you constantly have a feedback dynamic. So basically all of your ideas, or like all of what you are doing, but the same goes for the ideas, is constantly tested, being by algorithms, by society, and this is constantly in motion. So there is no not that there is not also like an outside position, but there is also no stable background, or constantly things are changing, and in the change there is a key. And it started in the 90s by these theoreticians at the Warwick Philosophy Department called Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, and they were basically like one of the first theory groups that kind of like again kind of gained a perspective on how this cybernetic loop or what kind of this positive feedback loops dynamic could achieve by kind of again pushing the critique or kind of trying to push things forward, not by changing, I don't know what people mean, or kind of constructing a more truthful position that people could rally for, but kind of like more immanently approach the situation and try to kind of subvert the current parameters in this way, to produce something that the current system or establishment isn't prepared in advance, because you can't be prepared for something that is waiting itself to construct itself. So it's a different kind of dynamic or a practice that cybernetics makes possible. But also within this, the fact that this kind of theorizing or writing in general was called theory fiction was connected to their general like predicament or awareness that as society is speeding up or accelerating, we need a different kind of writing. So at that time it was very kind of inflammatory that they were not afraid to combine, I don't know, theoretical concepts by Deleuze and Guattari, or I don't know, like Lyotard and others, with, I don't know, science fiction examples or jungle music or things like that. So we already gained a hybrid, and we already tried to kind of mesh these kind of new genres so that they would be able to produce a kind of a reaction or kind of like ignition point that would be productive. And so this was their approach, and it's reflected in their writing style, and it's becoming way, way more hectic and accelerative and so forth. But now in this historical trajectory, at least for myself, I think that I see theory fiction in a slightly different way, maybe more connected to the democratization of tools and knowledge. And I think that theory fiction is more like connected to what this philosopher of science, Feyerabend, was telling us, where he put forth this provocative remark that there is no like clear distinction between astrology and science, but the only thing that separates these two fields is the methodology and the scientific method that science is using, but we can't know in advance that the same thing cannot be replicated in other contexts, and maybe astrology is such a context, just it wasn't like pushed within this direction or within the academic space that this kind of approach would be possible. So I believe that something like that is currently at work, and this is reflected in how theories are produced nowadays. Like, if you think with the internet and with this extreme overflow of information, or to be more specific, let's say within, I don't know, media study space, there is no clear reason why within the academy we should study this thing and not the other. And a lot of the object of study are simply a product of, I don't know, like institutional frameworks, ossified theoretical constellations from the past, interest of professors and so forth. But because of this fast-paced interplay that is becoming ever more like present, we see that theory fictions are becoming like an attempt to test theories, to see like what kind of theories could produce a social response and could potentially like give us a perspective on the current moment or on what is currently going on. And they are mostly connected to the, I know, pop culture and art, but I don't see a reason why we couldn't find theory fictions even within hard sciences or in other fields as well. So I think that the theory fiction is mostly like kind of like a different kind of knowledge production and a different kind of learning. Like if we imagine like in machine learning where you have this difference between supervised learning and unsupervised learning, so it's like a different kind of ecological production of knowledge that is just kind of spitting out these new like chunks of knowledge that can be potentially actually operative if enough people go behind them and try to do, I don't know, a media lab out of them. So that would be my thing.
So just to connect that back again to the art context, so for me, like from my perspective as a curator, for example, theory fiction is a very interesting form, let's say, of writing. Just exactly for what Max was now describing, so that it's not basically writing about phenomena or like society or like certain cultural shifts or technological development or whatever, but somehow trying to be part of the processes and somehow also at the same time transform them or propose different fictions, theories as fictions basically that then become new realities. So art is, as I understand art, it for me at least, art is doing exactly that most of the time, you know. So in difference to art that you know describes or critiques, let's say, certain critiques the present, which is of course also important, this reflection, to understand the world in which that you inhabit, to be even able to feel the need that maybe something's wrong with it and you want a different a different reality or a different world or a different future. But then the next step for me, or like a necessary additional step, is to actually try to participate in the process of transformation, which is doing this work, performative work, like in terms of like performative language, basically. Yeah, that's a lot of artists, especially in the recent years. I mean, fiction became like a big word. There were books, you know, written about fictioning in art, for example, by Simon O'Sullivan and David Burrows. And then you have, you know, the world building keyword, which is also super present. So a lot of, you know, these ideas are also present in art practices themselves. So art practices somehow functioning as prototypes, models, propositions, new stories for narrating a different reality or a different future. And they are not treated, or at least looking at it as some like a theory fictional practice, they shouldn't be treated just as some like imaginary new worlds or ideas, but as actual propositions that just need to get, as Max said, enough people behind them to actually become reality. Of course, this is in the context of fake news and, you know, internet and so on, also could be understood as a, you know, problematic practice. But knowing that this context exists and knowing that basically, you know, presidents were memed into offices, obviously these kind of practices have a lot of power. And if we don't somehow try to understand it and participate in shaping reality, you know, ourselves, then in a way, I think we already lost.